Good.
So we'll go ahead and get started then. It's not my water.
Either. Good morning, everyone. Bradley Showman, Office of Legislative Counsel. And today I will do a walkthrough of House Bill 758, an act related to banning the use of rodenticides in the states. And so before I get started, members of the committee may remember the short form bill H326 that Representative Sakowicz introduced last session that would accomplish the same goal or purported to accomplish the same goal. And the committee took testimony on that issue. So I just wanted to give a brief kind of regulatory overview of how pesticides and rodenticides are managed in the state. So any pesticide is registered for a specific use in the state. There's three different classes that they're registered as. Class C is the lowest, and homeowners can buy those freely. And they might include things like DEET or insect repellents. Controlled sale is Class B. Controlled sale means that pesticides can only be sold at a licensed dealer, and there's restrictions around how they can be sold, and some of the labeling around the sale when you go into the store to buy it. But those are licensed dealers, not necessarily something you'd be able to get at a run-of-the-mill store. And then we have restricted use, Class A. Restricted use is can only be sold at a licensed dealer, and it can only be sold to certified individuals who are licensed to administer the pesticide. And so the sales for Class A and the uses for Class A pesticides are much more tightly regulated. Class A pesticides are considered restricted use. It's a term of art in the statute. That means the highest level of regulation goes into these, and restricted use pesticides can be restricted at the federal level, which means that it would be restricted at the state level. If a pesticide is not restricted use at the federal level, at the state level, a pesticide could be listed as restricted use and have more tight regulations at the state level, even though those regulations are not as tight as the federal level. So essentially, the federal regulations are the floor, not the ceiling in these instances. And that is in particular, that is helpful to understand the regulatory framework here for this rodenticides bill, because rodenticides are not restricted use at the federal level. And so many states have experimented, or I shouldn't say experimented, but many states have investigated and are passing regulations to list some kinds of pesticides, some kinds of rodenticides as restricted use. There's three categories, broadly speaking, of rodenticides that are more tightly regulated. They are first generation anticoagulant rodenticides and second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. The anticoagulant rodenticides essentially prevent blood from coagulating when the creature consumes the pesticide, and it bleeds out, essentially. And the first generation rodenticides are more slow acting than the second generation rodenticides. So the first generation rodenticides came first. Then the second generation rodenticides came along. They're much more fast acting, which means they're more potent. And there's concern that, because they're more potent, non-target species could be more affected by second generation rodenticides than first generation rodenticides. And because of that, in our regulatory scheme, second generation rodenticides are restricted use. They are Class A. And so we'll go into this bill and what this bill does to change that classification for the remaining rodenticides. But right now, second generation anticoagulant rodenticides are state restricted use.
Representative O'Brien.
Yes.
On the three classes, like you said, states have been experimenting with restricted use, even though federal government may not have them as a class A. It seems to me then that would lead to, I think, the pesticide or rodenticide companies suing states, saying that the federal government, I'm just thinking about floors and ceilings, that the federal government should be supreme in that, the federal law. And so how does that work? Like, could a state even ban these as opposed to just change classes?
Yeah, states can ban the use of pesticides, can and have banned the use of pesticides. So the federal law, the FIFRA, the federal, and I won't be able to pull out the full name of the statute now, but the federal law is the floor. And so the only thing that the federal law preempts is what specifically is on the label on the pesticide itself. And so the preemption issue is narrow to that particular piece. That is not going to stop a pesticide applicator from challenging the law in other ways. But in terms of federal preemption, in terms of states being permitted to do this, states are permitted to do this, and they can have more strict regulations on pesticides than the federal government.
So Vermont could ban DEET if we wanted to.
Potentially, yeah.
Interesting.
Hope you don't get Zika.
Zika.
You'll recognize me if I do.
All right.
Okay, and then the third category of rodenticides are non-anticoagulant rodenticides, and we'll go into the names of them. I have them. I'll point out where in this bill that those are written so that you can refer back to it, because it's good to kind of know the scientific name. But the non-anticoagulant rodenticides might affect the target creature or the target animal, like cause a heart attack or something of the sort. And act in that way. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, and I will pull up the bill, and we will just go through this. Moving the controls. Okay. And the first section is findings. We'll go over some of the findings. And so rodenticides, if used improperly and mistakes happen, can result in poisoning of individuals and poisoning of humans. So between 2017 and 2021, the Center for Disease Control Prevention reported 40,808 poisonings of humans for rodenticides, most of whom were children under 5.
Yeah, thank you. Was that reported poisonings or reported come into contact with? I believe it was come into contact with.
So, and I can look into how they define poison more thoroughly. So, the term poison, and you're right to point this out, but the term poisoning doesn't necessarily mean you're poisoned and you die, right? Or become seriously or grievously ill. Poisoning mean you could have some kind of adverse effect, right? So you become sick, you could become vomiting, you might have to take some kind of medication to make yourself better. And then in the more extreme situations, there are some pesticides out there that if you do take like one sip, you could result in death, right? And so there is a broad spectrum of what a poisoning could entail. At minimum, it is ingesting the rodenticide and then having a negative adverse effect. But I can look into more closely of how they define poisoning and get back to you on that piece.
It's like there are 6 findings here, and we perhaps collectively, maybe I should only speak for myself, but tend to not focus as much on the findings. Sections of bill. No, I'm saying, and I'm about to say, and that's not good. So we often we breeze over a little more quickly the findings and then move on to the substance of the bill. So I think it's important that we're all comfortable whenever not just this bill, but any bill, if we move forward that has findings in it, that we're all, in agreement that those are in fact, accurate statements.
I guess I would just say about the same thing, that if we're going to keep this in the bill as a finding, then it wouldn't be a finding unless we have testimony to support those findings. And if not, how did we find it? We didn't. We have to take it out.
Yeah.
That's my take on it.
Sorry, one more.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
At some point, will you almost do a side by side of like the last year and this, like why that bill sort of evolved into this one?
So the bill last year was a short form, and
Okay, so this is the longer.
yes, yeah. So this is technically a new bill, and so there was not statutory language drafted for the short form last year.
Okay.
So it remained a short form, and instead of amending the bill, Representative Sackler introduced a new bill here.
So like
it accomplishes the same
findings last year.
There were not listed findings last year in the bill. The committee did take extensive testimony on that bill, and they're sad.
Okay.
Bradley, I think maybe actually going back and starting with a statement of purpose on the first page would be good.
Okay.
Just so we can, in our heads, know what are we doing here? Because even though that was in the short form bill last year, it was long enough ago that it's not necessarily top of mind. Yeah.
Yes, no, and that's good. And I apologize for skipping over this. So this bill here proposes to prohibit the use of any first and second generation anticoagulant rodenticides and all non-anticoagulant rodenticides in the state, including use by commercial applicators. This bill would ban the sale, including internet sales, of first and second generation anticoagulant rodenticides and all non-anticoagulant rodenticides in the state. So also would authorize exemptions to these prohibitions when needed to control pests for an agricultural emergency, environmental emergency, or significant public health risk when no other pest control method would be effective. So essentially, this ban is modeled after the neonicotinoid ban, and to authorize exemptions in cases of emergencies, but to prohibit the use and more broadly. In 2024, the ASPCA, the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, reported 31,570 domestic animals in the United States suffered rodenticide poisoning. And that first generation, second generation non-anticoagulant rodenticides were the 7th most common toxin poisoning domestic animals. Rodenticides have been, so there is concern about rodenticides affecting non-target species, including non-target predators, such as raptors, fishers, foxes, coyotes, bobcats, and lynx. At the Department of Fish and Wildlife tested fisher carcasses for rodenticide exposure and had that exposure, and all had exposure in at least one or more rodenticides. In 21 and 2022, the department tested bobcat carcasses and found anticoagulant rodenticide exposure in 21 out of the 29 carcasses tested.
Awesome.
And if you prefer, maybe some of my questions be best left for like Fish and Wildlife and people, experts in the field. And if that's how you want to handle that, instead of questioning Ledge Council who may not have.
Yeah, I think that we can probably best use this time to understand what's in the bill and what the words are, basically. What are the words? What are the implications if it isn't necessarily clear from just looking at the words? And then, we can if we decide to move forward and take more testimony on this, then we can dig into it with other witnesses.
And and I think that's a good way to go about it, because sometimes exposure, like we spoke about with poisoning, sometimes poisoning does not mean you died from the substance. Exposure in this case does not necessarily mean that it died from the substance. It just had the substance in its system. And so witnesses may be able to kind of explain more fully how their data and the extent of their data can show a more causal link between the rodenticide and the death of the animal. And so components of rodenticides can bioaccumulate in fish and wildlife. First and second generation anticoagulant rodenticides and non-anticoagulant rodenticides can poison, harm, and kill rodents' natural predators, thereby counteracting regulation and control that natural predators of rodents provide. And the state of Vermont holds fish and wildlife in the state and the trust and in trust for the benefit of the citizens of Vermont pursuant to 10 BSA section 4081. So we will get into the meat and potatoes of the the law statute. And so the definition section here, this is just some framework. So an economic poison is defined as any substance produced, distributed, and used for presenting, destroying, or repelling an insects, rodenticides, etc.
This is all existing language.
This is all existing language.
Statute.
And rodenticides are defined. And so we also separate out second generation, first generation, and non-anticoagulant rodenticides. And here's a handy bookmark for the committee, especially when scientists come to testify, or if scientists come to testify, because the chemical names of these rodenticides are included here. And so it's a nice cheat sheet to have. I refer to this section a lot in my notes, and I can pronounce these names, but they are a challenge. And so that said, these are the specific chemicals that are in each of these categories. And when we're discussing them, that helps frame, is this a first generation? Is it second generation? Is it non-anticoagulant? And those categories can be important because each of those categories affect the target species differently.
Just before we go on to section 3, then see if there's any questions. It looks like we have an existing definition in statute now of second generation, but maybe not for first generation, since
That is
that's
correct.
the language.
Yeah, so the underlying language is new.
Okay. And likewise for the non-anticoagulant, there isn't an existing definition, I'm assuming, okay, for whatever reason, right?
And
Representative Nelson.
Council, do you know which of these are allowed to be used in the organic food production? I believe chlorcalciferol is able to be used in the organic food production line. I believe, I'm not sure.
Is that-
Maybe that's a question for ag.
Yep, yep. That's in 31.
Yeah,
reading that
31.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I'm not familiar with that. I think the Agency of Agriculture might be in better
Yeah.
position to answer that question.
Steve Donnell.
Yeah.
And so the first thing that the bill does substantively is discusses registration of the rodenticides. So each pesticide needs to be registered with the Agency of Agriculture. Class A, Class B, Class C, whatever it is, needs to be registered. And so this section here will amend the statute. So unless use of sale of a rodenticide is otherwise prohibited, and we'll get into that because this bill prohibits the use of all rodenticides. So unless the use is otherwise prohibited, the secretary shall register as a restricted use pesticide any first generation, anticoagulant rodenticide, so that's new, it's underlined. The second generation anticoagulant rodenticide is already in the statute. And non-anticoagulant rodenticide that is distributed, sold, or sold into or offered for sale within the state. So
Feel like it's helpful to sort of stop and think about what's happening here as a result of these changes to the language. So it looks like it's doing two things. First, it's saying we're going to require registration of not just second generation, but all rodenticide here. And then it's saying, in addition to that, the unless part is sort of foreshadowing something that's going to come.
Yes. And with one correction, so all pesticides need to be registered. So this is listing the three categories of rodenticides as restricted use. And that is the term of art for Class A pesticide, the restricted use, the highest level of regulation.
Okay. And right. So we talked about Class A, Class B, and Class C, and these are all.
And then, so what this would do is, so here the restrict, I guess I can't highlight it without doing that, but the restricted use pesticide, all first generation, second generation, and non-anticoagulant rodenticides would, as a matter of statute, be listed as restricted use unless they are otherwise prohibited. So that's the foreshadowing part, right? Because later on in this bill, we'll discuss how the use of these rodenticides would be prohibited in most situations unless there's a environmental, agricultural, or public health emergency. And Chair Durfee, I think we had a question.
I'm sorry. Who had the questions? Representative Brown.
When the definitions of the different categories are specifically designed by chemical name, does that mean that when someone invents a new one, if we want to ban that, we would have to change statute? Is that kind of?
Yes, and if someone invented a new kind of rodenticide, I think the statute would need to, if the state wanted to ban that rodenticide, the statute would need to be updated whether or not we list out the specific chemical names, because feasibly that rodenticide might not fall into a category of first generation or second generation, it might be third generation, right? Or it might be some other kind of rodenticide. And so the regulatory scheme from the statute or from the rule would need to be, would potentially need to catch up with new developments in pest control.
My other question is, does this include all rodenticides that are available, or are there other categories that aren't? I think there are not. I think this covers all of them. But
This covers all of them. The caveat is that there's potentially there's a different animal that's not necessarily a rodent, but sometimes the poison for that animal might be used as for rodent control. But that it's kind of a weird scenario that is not typical. And so the short answer to your question is yes, these are all the rodenticides. The longer answer is that, some people have used other kinds of pesticides to control rodents in ways that may or may not be
legit.
Yeah, exactly. And the EPA actually has looked into that and has tried to grapple with that, and there isn't an easy solution to that kind of situation. Suffice to say, if someone is using something for an off-label purpose, that in itself is a problem and prohibited by law and rule.
And I guess I don't see cats or mouse traps on the list.
Right. So yeah, so a mouse trap you can just buy at Shaw's, and because technically it's not a chemical.
Representative O'Brien.
So just to be clear, then this bill would have all these rodenticides essentially put it in a restricted category. So only trained, essentially users could apply them or even buy them?
And there's more. So yes, and this bill would also prohibit them, even a trained licensed provider, from using those pesticides unless there is an agricultural, environmental, or public health emergency. So it's a yes and to your answer to your question.
Would you mind scrolling back to the bottom of page 3? So the definition of rodenticide, so existing statutory definition.
This came up last year that like there's what did we use? It's like baking soda and something. It can cause rodents to essentially, explode, like they eat so much, but totally non-poisonous,
Interesting.
ingredients.
I'm not familiar with that in particular. I am familiar with how some non-anticoagulant rodenticides could cause a heart attack or something of that sort. And that might be what you're thinking about. I'm not familiar with the use of, I'm not familiar with the use of more common household goods for use of pest control.
Right, because you've got even like the high frequency thing to keep rodents away. And even, like what peppermint type essential oils.
So, and those would be Class C. And so those are required to be registered with the Agency of Agriculture. And so there's a big list of things that are A, B, and C on the Agency of Agriculture's website. And you can look and see, kind of like peppermint oils
Right, yeah.
being a Class C pesticide. And it's interesting. I would encourage you to kind of peruse the list because there's a lot of things on there. DEET's another one that's a very common thing that we all use, but it's very common that people use. And those are Class C, and so those are the least amount of risk to health and the environment, and but they're also required to be registered anyway and tracked. Okay. And so this section defines an emergency. And so agriculture emergency is already in the statute. Occurrence of any pest means an occurrence of any pest that presents an imminent risk or of significant harm, injury, or loss to agricultural crops. Environmental emergency is also already in statute. An occurrence of any pest that presents a significant risk of harm or injury to the environment, or significant harm or injury to the loss of agricultural crops, including any exotic foreign pests that may need preventative quarantine measures to avert and prevent that risk, as determined by the Secretary of Agriculture and Markets. This bill would add a significant public health risk to this category. And the significant public health risk is borrowed from relevant public health statutes, means a public health risk of such magnitude that the secretary or local health officer has reason to believe that it must be mitigated. And I think we have some questions.
Yeah, so would that number 16, would that cover food production areas? Like Agrimart in Cabot, their cheese plant, Maple Grove, anywhere where they're producing food.
Ben Jerry's.
Absolutely cannot have rodents in their plant. Redhead. They can't have rodents in them. Would they get an automatic exclusion from this and be able to hire trained professionals to go in and use it, or are they gonna have to get a determination from the Secretary of Ag after the Department of Health goes in and says, we're gonna shut you down?
And so that is a good question. And the statute as written would require an exemption and an as applied exemption. And so, an individual would have to say, I have a public health emergency or an agricultural emergency because I can't have rodents in this facility and rodents are going to come in if I don't use these rodenticides or something of that sort. And it presents an imminent risk to public health and safety. And would be as applied. And so they would have to apply for an exemption. If it would be possible to amend the statute to, require rulemaking to exempt certain categories or exempt certain activities from having to get an exemption or to create something of that sort. But this statute does not do that at this moment in time.
Thank you, Representative Bartholomew.
The way I would read this by significant public health risk would be something more like plague. Or some other virus that is suddenly transmitted by rodents. And I'm surprised, I'm assuming the secretary mentioned here is Secretary of Agriculture. It seems to me, just as a marker, that if we were gonna go with this bill, we'd probably want to have the Commissioner of Health involved in this.
Yeah, currently as written, local health officer, but the commissioner of health, might be a good person to bring in. And to your first point, I do not necessarily think it would be that high of a threshold in terms of like it have to be a plague or a new COVID type situation.
Certainly that would be an example.
But it would be, yeah, those would certainly be examples for sure. But it could just be, a significant risk. It's meant to be flexible, but, a significant risk to health or safety, transmission of a disease or something of that sort might fit into that category. And it's worth exploring and worth taking testimony on.
Representative Boston.
Yeah, I believe that there is another state that has already at least one state that has already passed legislation along these lines. I think it might be California.
That's right.
Yeah. Do you happen to know, is this very exclusionary perspective the way that theirs is framed or not? Because I'm just wondering, are we trying to have a stricter rule than what's passed in other places? Or is this modeled after that? Because my guess is that the committee's going to want maybe some more exceptions that are standard, not waiting until a food facility is invested by rodents before we would give an exception or something like that.
So this is not modeled after the California statute. This does go further than the California statute.
Okay.
And so the California statute does have some exemptions built into the statute itself.
Okay.
That would kind of like you were suggesting, and so that you wouldn't have to go in and ask for an exemption. It might be by statute, you can have exemption if you're this type of facility.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is out in front of a lot of other statutory schemes in regulating rodenticides.
One more question, and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, I believe, council, that maybe South Carolina has the same language we do on our second gen.
Mhm.
They have made second gen used by license only.
And that is correct, but it was the last I read, which was only a couple of months ago. The last I read that was a 1-year experiment and that has expired, I believe, in December, and they will determine whether or not to continue it. There are a few states that have done the same thing that we did with second generation rodenticides. So you're exactly right. And I think New York is another one of them where second generation rodenticides are restricted use. And Connecticut, it looks like, and then there's some proposals. So a lot of states are thinking about regulating these, like Rhode Island, excuse me, and New Hampshire as well. But most states do regulate them as restricted use. And so I'm not familiar with the state that regulates them as a ban, similar to how Vermont and New York have done with neonicotinoids, for example.
Most of what's left, I think, is new language, so we should probably let Bradley continue.
And thank you. And we define environmentally sensitive areas, and then second generation, rodenticides, in this statute, it's a different section in the statute, or different subchapter in the statute. So we're just putting these definitions in and referring back. And I'm breezing through those because, we're looking at rodenticides, pesticides, prohibited uses.
Representative O'Brien?
Just quickly, do we ever define rodents? I'm just wondering if, or target animal, because mostly it's mice and rats for targeting, but when you think of beavers and porcupines and woodchucks, for example, like, are there poisons that even Fish and Wildlife use to control those populations?
And that's a good question. I'm not sure we define rodent by statute. Looking at that, but basically what happens when you register the use of a pesticide, you register the target species and what that target species is. So at the registration process, that would happen. I don't think we're defining it by statute, but we actually might. Let me look at that.
Red squirrels.
Right.
I'm not saying that's how it should be used. I'm just saying some people may. Red squirrels.
And like Bradley brought up, I mean, what happens with, say, cottontails become, so overrun? They're not rodents, right? But we might use some of these poisons on.
So this section would prohibit the use and sale and distribution of any first generation, second generation, or non-anticoagulant rodenticide. And so full stop, it's banned. The second section B here says that the secretary may issue written exemption orders to suspend these provisions. So you can use them, but if you use them, they'll be used as a class A pesticide. If there's a valid environmental, agricultural, or public health risk, and the pesticide would be effective in addressing that concern, there's no other less harmful pesticide, and any adverse effects to non-target wildlife and environmentally sensitive areas are mitigated. And a written exemption order cannot be valid for more than 6 months. Specify the rodenticides to be used and the property and where it's going to be used. And provide detailed determination and evaluation of the agricultural emergency and risk. And establish restrictions to the use of the rodenticide in the order. And the exemption order must be submitted to the House committee, to this committee, and the Senate Agricultural Committee as well.
Was there a specific reference to IPM in there, or would that integrated pest management just be part of the certified users?
So when a certified applicator is using a pesticide, they are under very strict regulation, under strict rules about how they can use that pesticide. And rodenticide would be included in that. So the secretary would make rules, to the extent that they don't already have them, would make rules about how to use and administer those rodenticides. Integrated pest management is a type of pest management control that a farmer, a business owner, or a property manager might use to try and prevent or mitigate the instances of pests. And so it could be, for a property manager, trying to control where there's open food and things of that sort, sealing up foundations and things of that sort. So integrated pest management is kind of a broader idea of how individuals will manage their properties in order to try to prevent the pest from getting in. But part of integrated pest management is the use of pesticides. And so pesticides are often seen as perhaps a last resort, or if not a last resort-ish. But pesticide use is part of integrated pest management. And, and then the Secretary of Agriculture, after consultation with Secretary of Natural Resources, may rescind an exemption order. Such rescission would come into effect for 15 days. And this section is a section about rulemaking. And so the Secretary should adopt rules to administer the provisions in the statute. And in particular, the rules should make sure that use of the pesticides by certified pesticide applicators should not result in significant adverse effects to non-target wildlife and environmentally sensitive areas. So it would kind of ask the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets to do that. And then the effective date is January 1st, 2027. So a little less than a year from now. And that is the bill.
The rules in section 6 are to be applied when there's an exception granted.
Yes.
Exception.
Yeah. So, and that's exactly right, because this statute envisions that the rodenticides would still be used, just limits the situations to an agricultural, environmental emergency, or public health risk. And so when you use the pesticide, the Secretary should have rules specifically designed for this purpose to limit the negative impacts. It's very similar with how the neonicotinoids statute is written.
Representative Britt.
Just so I understand that when there is an exception granted, it can only be used by certified pesticide applicators.
That's correct.
Just for clarity again, of the first, second, and non-anticoagulant, which of those are not Class A at the moment? Any of them?
Second generation of Class A, and then the others are mostly Class B. I'm not familiar with any of the Class C that fits into the category I've searched. And I didn't see any Class C that fit into those categories. But the only ones that are Class A are second generation. If I may, though, I would defer some of those kind of questions about the categorization to the Agency of Agriculture, just to kind of get more detail about how these are classified and then how someone could use it, especially the differences between Class C and Class B. Because I'm not as familiar with the on the ground how individuals actually use it. So I'm familiar with kind of like the up here regulatory scheme, but I'm less familiar with, if you're a certified pesticide applicator, which some members of this committee are, how you're actually using them and what a person can buy with in certain what circumstances, for home use and things of that sort. So those are good questions to kind of get that more in the weeds analysis about how these are used.
You come in and present yourself as an expert, Bradley.
Okay.
Council, and we're convinced often that you are experts when in fact, maybe you don't know every last detail of everything that you write a bill about. Appreciate your taking our questions, and when we have 2 more times set aside for bill introductions today, and with the next one we only have half an hour, so we'll be focused. We'll have to focus a little more on just understanding what is in the bill here, and then if we feel like we want to take more testimony, we can certainly do that.
I was just looking at this one very odd definition on the bottom of page 3. That's just surprising. In existing laws, defining rodenticide, talking about controlling rodents, and then it goes on, or any other vertebrate animal that the Secretary shall declare pest. That's very weird for a rodenticide definition, because it could be bears, coyotes.
Yeah.
Very odd. I just jumped out of it.
Right. So, and if we do some work on the bill, we might want to think about, that too. We can propose our own changes, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed to me that if it would have to. Obviously, it can't be used outside of the scope of the federal label that's on the rodenticide, so.
Yeah,
That is correct. And so.
This doesn't really address that, yeah.
all right. Thank you, Bradley.
Thank you.
We will see you a little bit later. We'll take a short break. We have testimony next. We'll take a short break and then the Lake Champlain, for the farm coalition. I'm not sure if they're joining us on.
Which kinds of, what